Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call a meeting to order. Standing committees of priority and planning. To begin with, I'd like to ask everyone around the room to do an introduction, starting with Mr. Simpson.
Good morning, R.J. Simpson, MLA for Hay River North.
Good morning, Julie Green, MLA for Yellowknife Centre.
Good morning, Karen Testard, member for Cam Lake.
Good morning, Shane Thompson, Mandy.
Good morning, Herb Nakamak from the Nutfoot. And
I'm Tom Beaulieu, MLA for Tuneda Willowday, Chairman of Priorities and Planning. We just have one item on our agenda, that's the Arctic Policy Framework. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Premier McLeod for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With me I have Mike Omon, Deputy Minister of Executive Indigenous Affairs. Behind me, Gary Burnett, Principal Secretary, and Sean McCann, Director, Intergovernmental Affairs. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to bring you up to date on the Government of the Northwest Territories' participation in the development of the Arctic Policy Framework. The Arctic Policy Framework will be a Government of Canada document that is intended to guide federal policy and associated funding decisions in Northern Canada until 2030. It is important that it reflects the needs and priorities of Northerners. The federal government has committed to co-developing the framework with 3 territories, 3 provinces, and Indigenous groups. The Government of Northwest Territories has been actively participating in the development of the Arctic Policy Framework. I have spoken with both the Prime Minister and Minister Bennett on numerous occasions regarding the Northwest Territories' interests, what we want to see articulated in the final document. I have also been working with my territorial counterparts to provide a united voice on the territory's priorities for the framework. Together, we have developed the pan-territorial vision for sustainable development, which will help inform territorial interests, including the need for economic opportunities for people in the North to build self-reliance, live in healthy, vibrant, prosperous communities, and build capacities to reach their full potential. I want to see this vision clearly reflected in Canada's framework, and with the support from departments across our government, we will continue to do our best to support and be involved in this process. Northerners need a plan for the long-term social and economic development of the Northwest Territories, and Canada needs to be a part of that, including making concrete commitments to strategically invest in areas that will create the greatest benefits for Northerners, including new and existing sectors of the economy. The Northwest Territories deserves an equitable opportunity to be valued participants in the Canadian economy, and our people deserve the opportunity to achieve economic self-determination. I believe that this is best accomplished by supporting social and economic development through responsible resource development, job creation, skills development, and economic diversification, in addition to investments in transportation, energy and communications infrastructure, and innovation. I look forward to hearing your views on the Arctic Policy Framework and your thoughts on the interests and priorities that the Government of the Northwest Territories should be advancing with the federal government. I will ask Mike Omon, Secretary to Cabinet, to take you through a more detailed presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier McLeod. Kevin O'Reilly, Yellowknife Frame Lake MLA, has joined us. With that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Mr. Omon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, committee. We'll start on slide 2, a bit of the background. So, as folks may be aware, the Government of Canada has had policies with respect to Canada's north of the Arctic since the 1940s. Most recently, the Conservative government had Canada's Northern Strategy, which was released in 2011. The current process to develop the Arctic Policy Framework was initiated in December 2016 when Prime Minister Trudeau and former U.S. President Barack Obama issued the Canada-U.S. Joint Statement on the Arctic. At that point in time, the Prime Minister announced the moratorium in the Beaufort Sea, at the same time announcing that there would be an Arctic Policy Framework put in place The policy framework is intended to replace both the Northern Strategy and the Statement on Canada's Arctic Foreign Policy, which will have both a domestic and international component. And as we'll talk about a little bit later on in the deck, the international component of the policy is becoming very, very important to Canada. On to slide 3. When announcing the Arctic Policy Framework, Canada committed to co-developing with Northerners, territorial provincial governments, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. This is a whole of Government of Canada initiative. It is being coordinated by Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, or CIRNA, but its content crosses almost all federal departments. These departments are engaged in discussions, and some are leading the development of the APF, such as Global Affairs Canada, which will be leading the international component of the Arctic Policy Framework on behalf of the Government of Canada. On to slide 4. What is co-development? Today, Canada has clarified that co-development means that they will broadly seek input and work collaboratively in drafting this document. However, they have made it clear from the outset that the final document will be a federal policy framework and will be approved by the federal cabinet, and that the Government of Canada will have the final say on its content. Each territory and province, provinces that participate in this are Manitoba, Quebec, and Newfoundland and Labrador, along with ITK, will have receptive chapters in the policy framework, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the upcoming slides. So moving on to slide 5, a little bit more about the participants. So the federal government has committed to developing the policy framework with the governments of the Yukon, NWT, and Nunavut, who represent the territorial governments, provincial governments of Manitoba, Quebec, Newfoundland, and Labrador, Inuit Kanatami, and other Indigenous organizations and people. Stakeholder groups such as industry, youth, academia. CIRNA has shared some stakeholder information with the GNWT, but the scope of engagement continues to broaden. The federal government has been carrying out co-development in 3 main ways. First, they have established a working group of federal, territorial, and provincial senior officials to guide the development of the APF, and the GNWT is co-chairing this group with CIRNA. Secondly, they have been engaging directly with national Indigenous organizations, and they have been also conducting engagement sessions across the north in the provinces and in Ottawa. So on to slide 6. What do we think the Arctic Policy Framework will include? Well, the structure of the framework is still being negotiated and confirmed, but the federal government is committed to a chapter for each territory to set out its own priorities. It is also expected that there will be a chapter on Indigenous priorities. The territorial governments have been leading the process of developing the chapters for their respective territories, working closely with Indigenous governments and other stakeholders, including industry, business, NGOs, and other members of civil society. The GNWT has been gathering input for the NWT chapter. In January, we held a full-day engagement session with NWT and Indigenous governments. We also held half-day sessions with non-government organizations and another half-day sessions with business and industry. We have set up a section on the GNWT website that provides information on the Arctic Policy Framework and gives people an opportunity to provide their input. As I mentioned earlier, Canada has stated that the APF, or the Arctic Policy Framework, will address both domestic and international interests in the Arctic. And Global Affairs Canada has been leading the development of the international component of the framework and also have been engaging with other stakeholders, as we understand. On to slide 7. The discussion guide that the federal government developed for its engagement sessions includes the following themes, and they're on your slide here. Comprehensive Arctic infrastructure, strong Arctic peoples and communities, strong, sustainable, diversified economies, Arctic science and Indigenous knowledge, protecting the environment and preserving Arctic biodiversity, and Arctic in the global context. The federal government's engagement sessions are designed around these themes, but the final document may have a different structure as the feedback that they've been getting, and as the GNWT be getting, has included some of these themes, but have also focused on other themes as well. On to slide 8, NWT interests. As Premier McLeod mentioned, the GWT has been participating in the co-development process and has actively been putting forward NWT interests. For instance, we have made it clear that decisions about the North must be made by Northerners. And that means paying attention to the input provided by the GWT as well as NWT, Indigenous governments, non-government, and industry stakeholders. We've also told the federal government that the Arctic Policy Framework needs to result in a new federal policy commitments and funding, and that it cannot simply recycle or repackage existing commitments from other initiatives such as the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change. On to slide 9, continuing with our interests. The GNWT has continued to emphasize that there are significant gaps in programs, services, and opportunities between Northerners and Southern Canadians, and that the Arctic Policy Framework must be a tool to support transformational change to address these gaps and improve the lives of everybody who lives in the North. Transformational change is going to require significant investment, so additional funding needs to be allocated to Northern initiatives. These investments should be considered as a means of nation building and supported like other nation building efforts. Slide 10. As the Premier mentioned, one of the interests developed by the 3 territorial premiers is the Pan-Territorial Vision on Sustainable Developments. And last summer, the 3 territorial premiers developed and announced this, which outlines the territorial interest in the Arctic Policy Framework to a degree. These include the need for economic opportunities for people in the North to build self-reliance, live in healthy, vibrant, prosperous communities, and build capacities to reach their full potential. Essentially, we're promoting the idea that reaching these goals is best accomplished by supporting social and economic development through responsible resource development, job creation, skills development, economic diversification, in addition to investments in transportation, energy, and communications, and infrastructure and innovation, all as outlined in the Pan-Territorial Vision for Sustainable Development. On to slide 11, I'll talk about the next steps. The next steps for the GNWT, including a draft NWT chapter incorporating comments and input from NWT Indigenous governments and stakeholder submissions and sessions. The GNWT will continue to participate in the development of the total Arctic Policy Framework, and we will continue to advocate for the GNWT interests during the remainder of the engagement process while the document is being drafted. On to slide 12. We will share the draft NWT chapter for Indigenous input, government input, SCOP input, and finally cabinet approval. Challenge around all of this activity has been around the timeframes. So we see the current timeframes of trying to wrap up our chapter in April of 2018. We realize that these timeframes are very tight, but they are not our timeframes. We are marching to the drumbeat of the federal government, who is on a path to try and have this ready for release in August of 2018. And so what it means for the federal side of the equation as well, they draft the broader policy framework. They really need to have this package done for themselves, for their system, by the middle of July, so that they can release this in August. One of the motivations around the time frame, as we understand it, is that Quebec is going to an election in the fall of 2018, and the federal government would like to have this finalized and out prior to that happening. So that concludes my presentation, committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Omon. We'll open the floor up for Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of questions here. So the significance of the Quebec election is this Arctic framework includes Nunavik. Is that the significance of that? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Premier McLeod.
Yes. In early days, we advocated that the Arctic should only be the 3 northern territories, Nunavut, Yukon, and Nunavut. The federal government was of the view that it had to include Newfoundland, Labrador, Quebec, and Manitoba, because they have Inuit people in those 3 territories, so it does include Nunavik, Nunatsiaq, and Manitoba, because of Churchill.
Thank you, Premier McLeod. Ms. Green.
Thank you. I lived in Nunatsiavut for 5.5 years, and they're even less developed than the NWT, so I'm glad they're in here. That was just a timing question. So does infrastructure as it is used in this document include housing? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Premier McLeod.
Probably not if you look at the amounts of money that have been allocated to the Northwest Territories. So I think we would advocate for more housing money, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Premier McLeod. Ms. Green.
Thank you. Well, that's good to hear. I think that if we're going to have healthy people in healthy communities, housing is the start of it. And my last question is the linkage to the current infrastructure, the funding that we know about now that's already been announced to be spent over the last 10 years. How does this document relate to those infrastructure pots that we already know about, or maybe they don't relate at all? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Premier McLeod.
Well, there will be an infrastructure announcement today, and our position always has been is we don't just want to recycle federal announcements. So I would expect that the infrastructure I would see is infrastructure that would help us to transform and diversify our economy, which in my view, in some cases, depending what economic sectors you would be looking to advance in the north, may involve some significant additional infrastructure dollars over and above what has already been identified in the various federal infrastructure funds. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one thing I really appreciate about the approach you've taken is to clearly signal that any major project of infrastructure or otherwise in the north is a nation-building exercise on the part of Canada, and I think that's a message that needs to be very clearly stated and reinforced. I made similar submissions to the Federal Finance Committee when they visited us in Yellowknife prior to the last budget, federal budget being announced, and that seems to be a missing piece, that we're treated like every other province and territory, or sorry, every other province rather, and it doesn't recognize that we have very significant challenges being underdeveloped vis-a-vis where most provinces are. So I appreciate that. One thing that is on my mind is the constitutional development of the Northwest Territories, and I know that's a much broader question, but it does involve the federal government. We've seen a new federal department for Crown Indigenous Relations. We've seen new funding agreements that are bilateral in nature, and if the NWT continues along the path of fully realized self-government with drawn down powers, that has the potential to erode our funding base and fundamentally change the nature of this public government. How does this strategy speak to that, or does it not? And are we leaving that conversation for another day? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, as the federal government has said, this would clearly lay out its vision up to 2030. And I think that, in my view, the constitutional development of the Northwest Territories should be up to the people of the Northwest Territories. But having said that, the federal government has embarked on a major initiative to clarify Aboriginal rights of Aboriginal people. And in my mind, and I think you share the same sentiment, is once those Aboriginal rights are clarified, it potentially could have a major impact on our government to the extent of restructuring the whole government. And to the extent that we will probably have to have a constitutional development exercise, because the whole initiative is pointed to funding flowing directly to Aboriginal governments to provide their own programs and services. And I'm not sure how far this clarification will go, but it may go to the extent where you don't need self-government agreements, because the treaties will set out how Aboriginal governments can structure themselves, and that will be clarified through this Aboriginal rights process. So the Northwest Territories is a creature of the Government of Canada. we are through federal legislation, and they can change it at any time if they see fit to do so. So,
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Testard?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Premier. I think that this is, again, a complex issue, but we need to be cognizant of it as we embark forward, and I hope that we see some clarification in this document when it's finalized. The other question I had, or perhaps clarification, is around the economic diversification piece. I think we share the same view on this as well, that although diversification is important for Northerners who live here and are looking for more opportunities, when you think of the broader economic issues, our population is just too small to support the kind of government services that are required of a territory this size and this dispersed without something significant like resource development ongoing. And the federal government has obviously signaled a strong desire to protect Arctic biodiversity, which involves reserving large sections of land, given the ecology of the Arctic. So how are we managing those priorities? And I mean, my colleague, Mr. O'Reilly, spoke about this in the House yesterday, caribou or roads. And it's hard to have it both ways, given the sensitivities of the Arctic environment. So are we looking for, I mean, which side of this are we emphasizing? Are we trying to balance both? And how are we balancing both in going forward in this, almost 20-year document? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testard. Premier?
well, I think this document will go a long ways into signaling what the true federal agenda is for the Northwest Territories. I think that clearly we've been getting mixed messages. I think the moratorium would indicate they don't want to see any resource development in the Northwest Territories. Certainly, if manufacturing sector shut down in Ontario, you're not going to see the federal government imposing a moratorium on manufacturing in Ontario. So I think that if the federal government envisages the North developing its full potential, that the federal government will signal that it's prepared to invest significant amounts of money to transform our economy. If we can't have resource development, where are we going to have manufacturing, knowledge? We talk about knowledge economy. We're going to build universities, and I think I'm all for having a university in Northwest Territories, but I'm pretty sure that the 6 or 7 provinces and territories will probably all ask for northern universities. So I think that the level of investments, if the federal government wants to move away from having an economy, then they'll move more and more to more protected areas and more parks and so on. So I think they'll have, I think this policy document will go a long ways into identifying or showing what the federal vision is for the North. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Testard?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will say that it's not only the federal government that has a conservation agenda, this government does as well, and it's pursuing projects like Taidanenene, which many industry actors have concerns about. So I think we just need to be balanced about our criticism towards that approach, because we're not exactly pushing conservation aside. But leaving that aside, if we transform our economy that drastically, we have to transform our society as well, in either direction. So how are we, so caribou is a perfect example. If there are people who rely on hunting and gathering to maintain their way of life, and whatever industrial development we pursue removes that equation, or something similar, some sort of transformative economic change, our society will change as well. So are we contemplating that as well? Are we contemplating how we're going to manage, if this strategy puts us on a trajectory towards more resource development or a knowledge economy, what social supports are going to be built into this strategy? What do you envision the NWT chapter representing to support our people as our economy changes and therefore as our society changes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Premier?
Well, I guess we will be working very closely with Aboriginal or Indigenous governments, and clearly we want to see our communities to have healthy, sustainable communities, and we want to make sure that people in the communities can continue to practice a way of life. It's becoming very much more difficult because the southern, if I can call it that, the southern part of Canada and the world is always intruding to point us in a direction where, for example, it's very difficult to maintain markets, like for fur, for example. It's something that the southern Canada doesn't want us to be harvesting animals, and so we have to invest time and energy to try to maintain our markets, and I think that if that's not the case, then we'll have to start pushing our people to more towards getting jobs, getting trained for jobs that moves away from that kind of activity. So I think as a government, we've always found that it's been very good. It's a very good investment for us to invest in the communities to support traditional economies, and certainly I expect that we will continue to do so. I think that with climate change and with the fact that our wildlife species are being threatened, it was very concerning that we, at one time, the Bathurst caribou was close to 1 million. Now they're down to about 20,000, and I think that they'll need some significant investments, very similar to the boreal caribou, and so those are the kinds of things that certainly we'll have to take into consideration. And we've always factored in. We used to value the traditional economy at about $50 million. That was when Nunavut was part of the Northwest Territories, and that was if you had to go and if you live in a community, you had to go buy all your food at the northern store. That's how much more money it would cost, and certainly it would significantly impact not only our way of life, but also we'd probably have to redesign most of our social programs. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier McLeod. Are there any other questions? Mr. Nakamayak?
Thanks for the presentation. Just a couple of things here. You know, if Canada ratifies the Jay Treaty, which gives border crossings for Indigenous peoples, you know, there's Gwich'in, there's Inuit, there's Gwich'in, there's Athabascans. I think that needs to one of the things that we need to focus on as Indigenous people, and working with Indigenous governments in the territory. Like there's a lot of relatives between Alaska, Canada, and I would say Montana as well too. And as well as Eastern Canada. I think we need to ensure that the negotiations, when this happens, I know the GNWT is working hard on it, and I see the work that you do, and I appreciate it. I think we need to ensure that all these points that we're coming across with these Indigenous groups, that the GNWT is there at the negotiating table, and ensuring that when Canada drafts this plan, I know that we won't get everything that we want out of it, but I'm sure that we can ensure that we get as much as we can by being at the table and having the office in Ottawa. This is probably one of the key things that the GNWT has. I think that's very strategic, and it's important to be. It's actually very important to be right across the street from the Parliament. You can walk across. You can host meetings there, and I think it was a good move on part of the GNWT to do that. We need to continue our relationships with. I know we have in Canada, the GNWT is probably one of the leading governments working with Indigenous groups and leading the way, and as well, you know, to keep that continuity, to working with the federal government is important. Working with United Nations, you know, I know we have, this last year I saw our Minister one of our ministers traveled to the United Nations. That's important as well too, to ensure that we're working at the national level as well as the global context. It's very key for us to be involved and know what's going on around the world, so that we can I think facilitate and ensure that Indigenous groups are getting what they need out of their agreements, as well as GNWT relations with the Crown. For me, border crossings, working with the group that I work with, border crossings is important, and as well as trade amongst some endangered species and other things like that that affect Indigenous people's rights and harvesting and well-being. So I just want to know what the Premier has to say about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Over the years, we've looked at free trade zones, potential free trade zones with the United States, and certainly I think the Jay Treaty has been something that's been pursued for a long time. I think that with the Marine Mammal Protection Act, it's been very difficult for us to market crafts and that are made out of mammal hides or bones and so on. You can't take it into the United States to sell it, and so that's affecting us. I think that I think with the advent of cruise ships, where we all heard about the cruise ships coming in and stopping in Arctic communities, and the cruise ship telling the Americans, well, don't buy any products made from marine mammals because you're not going to be able to bring it back in the United States. So I think certainly that would benefit us there. I think that the United States has a history of when it comes to things like dealing with polar bears, they don't deal with the problem, they deal with symptoms. So instead of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from climate change, which is resulting in less sea ice, they put in place a ban on hunting of polar bears, those kinds of things. So I think we have to pursue every avenues that we can try to maintain the way of life of the people in Northwest Territories as much as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Nakamayak, have anything further?
Just one more thing. There's a few things here that I'd like to just mention about that. The GNWT can work with the Government of Canada and beyond. The bodies of the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, the Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which would likely help. Anyway, I know recently there's been a call for a ban on ring seal to put on the endangered species list. Although, like the Premier says, that's a symptom of some other organizations outside pushing Canada to do that. And that's an example of Southerners telling us what we need to do to make this world turn. And I think that we've had so much of that we've been suppressed. And I think this framework gives the GNWT a chance to partner with Indigenous governments to help make our case more solid to what our self-determination should look like in the future, now and in the future. I think it's important for the GNWT to have maybe liaisons working with Indigenous governments within their own Indigenous government to work closer together so that all our priorities align and that we're working towards the same goal. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. Premier, any comment on that?
No, thank you. I think that's why it's important to pay attention to all of these different initiatives and different conservation efforts as well. I mean, it became very obvious to me that when I went to Iceland and the Arctic Circle Conference, there was 25,000 people, and I was very surprised at the number of philanthropists that was there. I was invited to dinner every night, and they're all looking for causes to invest their money in. A lot of it is to stop a lot of the activities that we do here in the Northwest Territories or in the Arctic. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm just looking at the webpage on the Executive and Indigenous Affairs website. This is about the Arctic Policy Framework, and the survey's mentioned here, but the deadline seems to have been March the 2nd. Is it still open, and what sort of public communications are there going to be around this? I know that there were some meetings in January, but maybe I'll just start with whether the survey is still open or not. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Premier?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. We've been going back and forth with the federal government. We keep asking more time. I think even some of their officials would probably support us in that, where the federal budget is already out. It came out on February 27th, so I guess realistically, whatever comes out of the Arctic Policy Framework, I expect won't show up until any subsequent budgets. So, so I think originally the federal government or the minister responsible wanted the document to be done by July. So now they pushed it back to August. So I think we've gained at least a month. Maybe I'll ask through you, Mr. Chair, for Mr. Omond to clarify the toing and froing that went on.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Omond?
Thank you. So the toing and froing that the Premier refers to is still ongoing, but there's going to be a little more flexibility, and we will change the date on the website and take a public comment around that to reflect that. But as I tried to, I guess maybe I wasn't clear enough in the deck, but the date is a fairly fluid thing. We do know at the back end, I mentioned earlier, around they're trying to have this done by the end of August. The latest we've heard is that this needs to be wrapped up for their own purposes by mid-July at the latest. And so, in just talking to Sean, that we'll change the date to at least to March 15th at this point in time to take public comment. But again, this is a very fluid situation with the feds. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Omond. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the fluidity of the date and the constraints that's putting on everybody. I think there was some discussion earlier too about there was a couple of roundtables held in January, one with business and industry and one with NGOs. Are the results of those available, and are they going to be put on, say, this web page as well? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Premier?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. That's our intention. That's what we'll do. I think that also we have been looking at some other economic summits, which perhaps we may not be able to organize in time for the Arctic Policy Framework, but our expectation is we will still have them with involving our Aboriginal government partners. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks for that. If there was just a little bit more information on the webpage as well, maybe even links to the Ministerial Special Representative report, the federal webpage, that kind of thing would be helpful, I think, as background information. I know we have some people here from Denny Nawo that they prepared their own submission on this. Maybe just a few additions to tune this up a bit so that folks know where they can go to get some more background information. Last point I guess I want to make, Mr. Chair, is I was pleased to see in the presentation that this committee will have an opportunity to see a draft of the chapter so that regular MLAs will have some input into it, and I'm pleased to see that commitment and look forward to seeing a draft at some point. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Anything to comment on, Premier?
Yeah, I guess we said we would do it. I guess our only caution is that the timelines will be very tight for a turnaround. So, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Testard?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the previous, what was it called? the Canada's Northern Strategy of 2011 had a lot of military components or national defense components, including the construction of deep water ports and armed icebreakers, and obviously those things didn't happen. So Arctic sovereignty tends to be something that Southern Canada understands in terms of military or defense policy and defense spending. I'm just wondering if, as that's bound to be part of the federal strategy moving forward, if we have a position on that, and if we're getting involved in conversations around defense policy for the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Premier?
Yes, thank you. Certainly, we think that defense investments in the north would certainly go a long ways to improve our economic situation. I would like to see our Army base in Inuvik come back. Certainly would like to see some, with the fact that the Beaufort Sea is ice-free. It used to be 20 years ago, it used to be ice-free 5 weeks a year. Now it's probably ice-free more than 20 weeks a year. Certainly would like to see the Coast Guard have some presence there. We don't have a port of any sort. There's no equipment or anything. I'd like to see search and rescue move north instead of if every time there's we call in search and rescue, they have to fly in from Comox or Trenton. I think that Arctic sovereignty, we've always said the best way to promote Arctic sovereignty is to have healthy, sustainable communities, so we would certainly want to see more investment in that area. And I think that certainly defense installations, and I think that if one of the visions is that those, I guess obviously the government of Canada sees the Northwest Passage as Canadian waters. Other countries see it as international waters, and I guess depending on what the federal government does and whether they invest in, I think they're building some Arctic ships right now, but if they invest in more icebreakers, like the Russians, for example, they're building 15 ports and 20 new icebreakers, for example. If we did something, not even half of that, I think that would go a long ways to enhance our Arctic sovereignty as well. So,
thank you, Premier. Mr. Testard, anything further? Mr. Testard?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that. I just want to make sure that that's a component of our chapter, at least, or that we make those representations to the federal government. I know a lot of this is dependent on them, but I think, as the Premier mentioned, this is an economic issue. So the kind of spending that would come from defense projects would support local economies, and it's another thing we need. And the Coast Guard is a very salient point. If we continue to see cruise liners coming through the Northwest Passage, then we're going to need fast response to any kind of accident that would happen. We can't wait for British Columbia or Manitoba to support those kind of operations. So I hope that we'll see the NWT chapter include a submission from us on defense policy and defense spending. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testard. Premier?
yes, certainly we'd like to go there. I guess we'll have to see what the federal government has, I guess because of national security issues, they're not always as forthcoming on national defense information, but certainly we'll put forward a case. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In regards to our chapter, are we working with the Nunavut and Yukon government and comparing our proposals or our chapters so that, that we could be working on some commonalities there? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Premier?
We work together on the Pan-Territorial Sustainable Development Framework. We continue to compare with our counterparts. We have a Northern Premiers Forum coming up early May. Some of our counterparts have different approaches. I think Yukon sees it as a federal policy, so they had written to them saying, well, we'll review, if you write anything about Yukon, we'll review it. And none of it, I think, are very similar to us. I think maybe I'll ask Mike Oman to update us on where Nunavut's at. They've had a change in government, and they've been focusing on developing their mandate. So, but we do interact quite a bit with the three, certainly at the premier level.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Omont?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the three territories are using the pan-territorial vision for sustainable development as sort of a broader framework or guidelines. But the chapters of each territories will reflect the unique circumstances of each territories and reflect the realities of each territories and what the priorities are. But, all three territories, to a similar degree, suffer from a lack of infrastructure, lack of social housing, for example. There are educational levels of society that we need to close the gap on. So we share many similar things, but the unique circumstances of each territory and each economy in each territory is somewhat different, and so the chapters of each of the territories will reflect that. But the three territories are using the pan-territorial vision as sort of a guideline or a framework from which they'll develop each of the respective chapters from. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Omont. Premier?
Yeah, just further to that, when we met with the three northern premiers, we met at the Northern Lights conference. We had a lunch meeting, and at that time, it was obvious that where we should be seem to be working in tandem on a number of issues, including climate change, including Arctic Policy Framework. There's a whole host of areas. We're all at different levels, so we asked our officials, so the top officials from the three territories met last week to make sure that everybody had the same level of understanding, and so to that end, we're trying to coordinate as best we can. Obviously, each territory is free to go their own way, but we're trying to make sure everybody has the same level of information.
Thank you,
Mr.
Premier.
Chair.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you. I appreciate that answer from the Premier and the Deputy Minister. I think it's very important that we work, together. I know we're unique, but I mean, we are the three sister territories, and again, we are creatures of the federal government, and I think that's important to recognize, and I appreciate the work that's being done. Mr. Riley talked about getting, a copy of the draft and, look at it, and because of the tight timeframes, is there a possibility to get some information that you've been working on right now so we can, move on, realizing that the time frame is really tight? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Premier?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. We're prepared to provide committee updates on a regular basis, share whatever we can.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, and I appreciate that from the Minister. I guess my last question is in regards to, you talked about Aboriginal governments getting together and a meeting and that, and because of the time frame we're really short, will the Government of Canada entertain, new information or new stuff past the deadline they've imposed on us, i.e. March 15th? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We don't know. Certainly, Indigenous governments with this new distinctions-based approach. Probably the Inuit are the best organized. They have their own chapters written. I think they've been sharing information. They can have input in both the ITK section. They have input into Quebec, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Northwest Territories. None of it. The AFN is probably not as, because half of, or most of the land claims, Aboriginal governments have land claims, the AFN don't, or Dene Nation or AFN don't represent them. The Métis have no association with MNC, so we're not sure how the federal government is going to deal with those chapters. And we're working with the Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories. Similarly, the federal government's holding their own summits with Indigenous people in the Northwest Territories. So I guess at some point it'll all come together. I'd be very surprised if they take any input after their deadline, because their drop dead date is August, so you have to work back from there. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier. I don't see anything further. Premier, I'm wondering about the discussion on any sort of conservation economy with this framework. I see that there's quite a few pieces of legislation available to protect wetlands, for example, and just to protect land, period. But the conservation economy has a very small carbon footprint, and it's sort of become known that the federal agenda is to try to protect a certain percentage of land in the territory, in the country. I'm wondering if you guys had any discussions with in that area while developing this framework. Premier?
Well, certainly not necessarily through the Arctic Policy Framework, but certainly through Dene Nene. We've had a lot of discussions about the conservation economy, and we haven't been able to clearly spell out or identify what kind of jobs that would involve. Certainly I've been invited to Haida Gwaii to see it in action. But we're working with Aboriginal governments that are involved in that process. We're getting, I don't know whether they're facetious or not, but where if we have no oil and gas, we should be selling protected areas for money to the south. I don't know how that would fly, but that's certainly not something that we envisage, but we're prepared to discuss. We think that we have to look at all of the options and try to come up with a chapter that we think is best describes the Northwest Territories, with input from a wide variety of governments and peoples and stakeholders.
Thank you. I see no other questions, so I think we can. I'd like to thank the Premier and Mr. Ormond for our presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call a meeting to order. Standing committees of priority and planning. To begin with, I'd like to ask everyone around the room to do an introduction, starting with Mr. Simpson.
Good morning, R.J. Simpson, MLA for Hay River North.
Good morning, Julie Green, MLA for Yellowknife Center.
Good morning, Karen Testard, member for Cam Lake.
Good morning, Shane Thompson and Andy.
Good morning, Herb Nakamak from the NACPUT.
And I'm Tom Beaulieu, MLA for Trinidad-Willowday, Chairman of Priorities and Planning. We just have one item on our agenda, that's the Arctic Policy Framework, and with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Premier McLeod for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With me, I have Mike Omon, Deputy Minister of Executive Indigenous Affairs. Behind me, Gary Burnett, Principal Secretary, and Sean McCann, Director, Intergovernmental Affairs. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to bring you up to date on the Government of the Northwest Territories' participation in the development of the Arctic Policy Framework. The Arctic Policy Framework will be a Government of Canada document that is intended to guide federal policy and associated funding decisions in Northern Canada until 2030. It is important that it reflects the needs and priorities of Northerners. The federal government